Hey, everybody, welcome to another episode of the Exercise Mechanic Podcast. I'm once again joined by Ryan Taylor and Brett Patterson. Today, we are going to be talking about strength training considerations and periodization for endurance athletes. But before we do, we're going to bring you guys up to speed on what's been happening with the Exercise Mechanic team, because there's been a lot that's been going on over the course of the past month or so. And so first and foremost, before we dig into today's topics, gentlemen, how are you guys doing today?
Doing great.
Good, dude. How are you?
Hanging and banging, man. Hanging and banging. So Ryan, why don't you kick us off with regards to updates? You know, there's the hypertrophy intensive activate. There's the conference that you went to in Vegas. Why don't you get us started?
Yeah. So obviously we just hosted our, is it third or fourth hypertrophy intensive in Ottawa?
And fourth, I believe.
Fourth in Ottawa, April 5th and 6th at the 613 Lift Gym, which was definitely, I think it was a unique challenge. I don't know if you guys would agree. I think there were some major advantages to hosting in a space like that, mainly just access to like equipment that's a little bit different than you always get in like a commercial gym. But downsides being when you have a, big commercial gym, they've got spaces that are designated for kind of hosting courses and having meetings and stuff. So there's always an element of having to be creative with the space. When you're in a gym that's not really designed for that. I would say, we were talking about this maybe a little bit before we started recording. Every time that we've done one of these courses, the material's changed bit by bit. And I think there's always this element of refining. Something that I think is, actually maybe worth talking about on here. And I was having a conversation with a client of mine maybe last week. There's a line that you use often, ET, about every time you say yes to something, you have to say no to something. And part of the tinkering process, isn't just, oh, this course is becoming this perfect thing, course by course. It's you have a finite amount of time to teach what you need to teach to students. And unfortunately, you can't do 3 or 4 days in a practical sense because people have day jobs that they go to during the week. So you've got to ideally try to fit it within a 2-day period. We could teach everything over a week or 2 weeks if we really wanted to, but we just don't have that luxury. So I do think that there is difficulty in learning what to say yes to, learning what to say no to, figuring out how that flows. I don't know, I'd like to hear both of you guys, like what your input is. I think that our day 2 is pretty close to nailed. I feel like our day 2 flows very well. And, even now I find because there's like a prerequisite, there are prerequisite pieces of information that we have to teach on day 1 that I still feel like it is clunky and this like thing that's, kind of a work in progress. The funny thing is when I talk to students, we've had people do it who are friends or clients, the student experience is really positive. So they don't really seem affected by it, but I'm always in the back of my head. I'm like, I would like if we did this a little bit differently. I'd love to include this, but then like, where do we fit it? It's definitely a challenge. So I don't know, ET, if you got some insights onto that as well.
Yeah, man. I mean, I think this is something that I've kind of just accepted as being a part of the game, that there are so many other courses out there that their curriculum really doesn't change year on year, month on month. But truly the people that arguably learn the most in every course are the people that are teaching. Teaching forces a depth of integration that is, it's just different than the student. And so every single course, you learn things that then modify the subsequent courses. And that's just the game. That's something that I very much just kind of accepted. So yeah, I agree. There's this constant feeling of like, these are things that worked. And then also these are opportunities and challenges that are presenting themselves. And so how are we going to tackle those things? So that would be my first piece, I guess. And the second piece has to do with, interestingly, I do really value the student feedback. Of course, like we get every single student to complete a questionnaire at the end of the weekend. We look through all of them. We look through all of their feedback of how we can improve subsequent courses. And what is also true is that I actually allocate zero importance to their rating of the course. Like if it's a 1 or a 10, I actually kind of don't care, because I've found that very often, and this isn't a knock on the students, but it's an advantage that you have as the one delivering the content, is that the student doesn't know what they don't know. In contrast to the teacher, the one that's selectively choosing what to present and what not to present, you have a larger kind of bigger picture understanding of the journey that you're taking them on, the selective pieces of information that you're giving them, the things that you're strategically omitting for various reasons. And so because of that, like the instructor's perspective of the course quality is just more accurate than someone who's experiencing it for the first time. And there's also dynamics also between instructors and students. And sometimes students feel really shitty about giving honest feedback. Actually, I tend to do this. I don't know if I did it in the last course, but I tend to tell students, like, I don't want a 10. You're not allowed to give us a 10 on 10. Because it's just bullshit. Like it isn't a 10 out of 10. So you're not allowed to, but then a lot of students do. And that's not to toot our own horns. It's just, I think students tend to do that because maybe they're appreciative, et cetera. And that's fine. And I love that. But I think that like, I take general feedback about course quality, whether it be a 1 or a 10, with so much salt. Because the one that truly has the greatest, I guess, not objectivity, but the one that's really qualified to make decisions and assessments about whether or not it was a good course or not is the instructor. It's not the student, at least in my opinion. Those are my thoughts. What do you guys think?
Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, I was curious Brett's opinion. We've run this a handful of times, but I think this is the second time, Brett, that you've been a part of it. And I think I actually am really interested in your perspective of this, just because you're kind of like in the in-between space where I'm sure it's easy for ET and I to get caught up, maybe being tunnel vision a little bit, and you have an opportunity to kind of take a step back and observe us as well as the students. So I'm really intrigued by your feedback.
Yeah, it was a unique experience because it was probably about half the size of the group of the first course. So participation was a little bit less. I think there was a few trainers who are maybe a little less experienced or just had a little less time in the field. And so probably we're asking a few less questions or fewer questions just because they didn't know what they didn't know, like you said, ET. But you guys adjusted really well to it, I found. And day 2, you could definitely see people were coming out of their shells and talking a little bit more and participating a little bit more. Which was really interesting. I really love the course content and your ability to be kind of flexible like that, dynamic, I think is really valuable than just like a really strict course that, you hit these points and if you do, you succeed and that's it. You guys are really able to think critically in the moment.
Thanks, man. And that's something that's hard is, because we do try to tailor the courses to the students' interests and then also experience level and like depth of understanding. And it can sometimes be challenging to reconcile that with like what are the foundational pillars that we absolutely need to cover. And then if you manage to cover all those things and everyone is running with it or sprinting with it, then great, you can go deeper based off of your kind of read of the students. But it's not an easy thing to do. And to your point, this course presented some unique challenges just because of the students that we had with us. Like there were some that had a lot of experience as trainers. There were some that had some experience as trainees and that wanted to be trainers. And then there were some other folks who had a lot of experience as a trainee and are going to be a trainer. So it's like there was a whole mix of everything, you know. And so definitely presented some unique challenges.
I think my favorite bit was the what was it? Going from gym bro science to gym science bro.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Moving science up a notch. Yeah, for sure. No, I enjoyed it. I always have a good time teaching those courses. We also, you know, not so long ago, Ryan and I presented at Activate, which was really great. Myself, I presented on this kind of relationship between biomechanics and the experience of pain, and then also injury. Ryan, if I remember correctly, you presented on insulin sensitivity, nutritional periodization, and stuff like that. How did that go for you?
Yeah, it was good. The funny thing, you know, I'll talk about this a little bit later too, because I also attended a conference as a student, which was fun. And there was a variety of presenters there that also spoke about nutrition. I think something that's funny that's sort of developed in our work dynamic is in terms of like relative levels of experience and knowledge. I've, you know, probably got a little bit more on the nutrition side, but I don't consider myself an expert in it by any means. But I've sort of settled into that role a little bit with the exercise mechanic, which is funny. But in a sense, it's actually forced me, I think, to be even better at it, which is not a bad thing. As we talked about before, you know, I think when you're in a position where you're teaching anybody, I feel at least this massive sense of responsibility to deliver information that's not just correct, but that's also valuable. So there is a huge degree of learning that goes through that process. To answer your question, yeah, it went great. I always have nerves before things like this, but never about teaching it. I always have nerves about like logistics. So I'm like, am I going to find the room? Is there going to be parking for me? And that's the thing that I get stressed about. I'm like, is my mic going to work? I had this like irrational fear that I would have the one PowerPoint that didn't work. So like it's things that aren't even related to actually teaching the content. And then, you know, it went seamless. I will say kudos to the Activate team. They did an awesome job.
I was going to say,
it made it very, very easy for me. They had everything set up. They just clipped a mic on me, gave me a clicker, and I was kind of good to go. I think there was maybe 25-ish in person, and then I think another 10 on Zoom. So we had like 35 attendees. And yeah, it was really good. It ended up, you know, there's an element of ad-libbing that I like to do with courses, and I guess now some lectures as well, where I'd say, you know, I've got a very good idea of what I want people to walk away with in terms of like, these are the key nuggets in terms of like what's important. I don't care that much if people memorize like a specific mechanism. The reality is in today's day and age, you got Google and ChatGPT if you forget something. You know what I mean? Like I have textbooks in my house. As long as I have enough knowledge to know the things that I need to reference, I think that's good enough. And then as long as you have a general understanding of like the big picture, to me, that's what's really important. In particular, if you're working as a coach or a trainer, like you're just not going to have a client ask you, they're not going to ask you, you know, what ribosomal protein stimulates mTOR. It's just not a conversation you're ever going to have. You know what I mean?
Totally.
So that stuff just doesn't matter as much to me. So I think that actually gives you some flexibility to ad-lib some storytelling in there in order to deliver the information in a way that's more presentable. So
Man, I totally agree. And, like this comes back to one of the central themes of a lot of the stuff that we teach, which is like not losing the forest for the trees. And, sometimes, especially within the world of training, which is very like practical, it's where the rubber meets the road of like impact in people's lives. Molecular mechanisms, essentially, when it comes to the client, don't matter unless they care about it, which is ultra rare. But it reminds me of one of my favorite quotes by Einstein, which I actually have in the internship, and I might butcher it because I don't have it in front of me, but I just wrote down a prompt, and he said something along the lines of everything should be made as simple as possible, but no simpler. And for me, that's kind of like aiming to like, right, how can I simplify this? And to your point, really add in storytelling, take people on a journey and an arc so they can understand the pieces that are really important here. And that usually requires some intentional simplicity and sometimes some things that are not 100% true, but they're true enough as a means of getting a certain point across to people, and all of that without going too far down the road of simplicity where you don't like honor the content. And that's tough. I find that tough. And how would I say? But it's an important thing to kind of contend with, especially when it comes to working with trainers. Like when we're teaching, we're not guiding people through what they need for a PhD thesis or anything like that. It's like, no, this is just like teaching them what they need to know so that they can be effective,
ET, I got a question for you. I remember attending like 8 years ago, probably, one of your pain classes for the general public. And there was
Epic.
Among a couple of people in the audience, there was like a little bit of pushback. It can be a big paradigm shift to know that like your pain isn't purely mechanical. And I'm wondering with, either a different crowd, if you're presenting to trainers versus the general public, or, the time as time has gone by, people are more accepting of these ideas, or have you just gotten better at presenting? Do you ever get any of that pushback? Or do you find people are a bit more accepting of the kind of like biopsychosocial model?
So really good question, man. I don't think it's reached the masses enough for the difference in receptivity that I've experienced to be kind of explained by people being more accepting and aware of like a more biopsychosocial take on pain. Honestly, and at risk of pumping my own tires, but I think I've just iterated it enough to get better at storytelling. Like if I look at my old slide deck that I used for that presentation, which was called Pain Redefined, it's very, very, very different. Now there are certain things that are the same, but there's a lot that has changed in terms of the actual content. And then also the anecdotes that are shared are different. Like I think thinking back to that specific presentation, because it was more public facing, there should have been, I think, probably a little bit less of the sciencey things and a little bit more anecdote. Now when I'm teaching trainers, I think I use different sciencey things and also different anecdotes. So yeah, I don't know, man. I think it has to do with more so pivoting my strategy, because I have noticed that people generally, they get it. It seems like they get it now faster with less resistance. But yeah, I don't think it's because it's reached the masses at all. I think there's still a lot of work to be done. Yeah. Yeah.
I am curious how your presentation went. I don't think we've had an opportunity to talk about it.
Yeah. Thanks, man. It went well. I'm very similar to you. I have enormous jitters and butterflies before. Like I looked at like my like Garmin watch before, and my heart rate sitting down was like 118 or something, which is abnormal, by the way. That's like 2x at least of like where I'm at right now. So yeah, heart rate was quite high. I was nervous, but and actually I was quite nervous up until I had a conversation with my wife about an hour or so before, because I was really putting a lot of pressure on myself to just nail this presentation within the, and what do I mean by nail? I mean like delivering the most perfect presentation on the relationship between biomechanics and pain science. And I shared that with my wife, and she was like, you know, that's impossible, right? Like for it to be actually complete, like a complete conversation about both of those topics, like you would need years, you know, because if you think of like people that specialize in biomechanics, that's like years of study. If we're talking about like pain neuroscience, that's also impossible for it to be perfect, because we still have no fucking idea. And so she was like, cut yourself some slack and maybe share that with the group. So sharing with the group at the beginning that it's like, listen, like I'm going to share some big rocks with you guys, and things that seem to be true as of our current understanding right now. And this is not going to be like an exhaustive conversation that covers every single angle. I mean, it's impossible. But what we are going to talk about today are going to be some key points that are really important for you to understand. And that for me just immediately like got rid of a lot of my my anxiety, because for me, all of my anxiety is exclusively about whether or not I'm going to be able to deliver shared meaning to the students. For me, that's always where it comes from. And so kind of letting myself off of the hook of that was big.
That's really cool. Do you mind if I interject with a brief anecdote?
Yeah, sure,
so
man. Of course.
my wife and I had a very similar conversation. Actually, she was speaking to some Algonquin students about her interior design career, and you know, she was kind of telling me beforehand about how like, well, I can't take credit for everything I've done. You know, I've worked very hard. I've also been really lucky, and some people took some big risks on me, and it paid off. And that's a big reason why I'm here. And I'm like, you can say that. Like, you can tell them, like, yeah, I've worked very hard to be where I am. I'm also incredibly lucky and got some great breaks. And allowing yourself to be vulnerable, I don't think is a drawback. I think that it helps connect you with the students, and they're like, oh, he can't fit it all in. He's human.
Yeah, man, totally. And I agree. You know, I have one more thing to share, and then I know Rai, you wanted to talk about the conference that you went to, but this little piece is kind of relevant to what you just shared, Brett. So not long ago, that's a lie. It was beginning of COVID. I had like a business coach that I was working with. I don't even know when beginning of COVID was. Like, what was that, 2020? Like, I've completely lost touch with this. Yeah. When he and I first started working together, he said, don't do yourself the disservice of putting me on a pedestal. He said, because I'm making this shit up just as much as you are. And for me, that was like, what? Because I was paying this guy a lot of money to help me kind of navigate the COVID situation and kind of stay afloat and all those types of things. And initially it was a little bit jarring, but then it was like, it really, what it did is, because I had put him on a pedestal. And so initially, like what that did is it essentially just did this. So it made room for like relating from the same level, human to human. And it was way more productive, because instead of just me waiting for him to tell me what to do, it was more creative. There was more iteration and conversation back and forth. And so
It's a
to your
collaboration.
point, yeah. And the vulnerability that is kind of like required for collaboration. How would I say? Can sometimes be a little bit scary initially, but then once you do that, you immediately you rip the Band-Aid off. You immediately feel better, at least in my experience. Ryan, we we've got about 3 minutes to talk a little bit about this conference that you went to, because I know you had a really great experience, hosted by a good friend of ours, Aram. And then we'll dig into the primary topic for today.
Yeah, so literally the day after the Activate conference, I was on a flight to Vegas for the Real Coaches Summit. So I think we very recently released the episode with Aram. So if you haven't listened to it, check it out because he talks about it. And it was honestly really fun being able to be a student again. Because I haven't done an in-person course as a student in a while. I think since I was still a trainer. I've done some online stuff, but it's never the same experience. So yeah, like that event, Vegas is a really interesting city. Aram did a really awesome job of making it, I think, very attendee friendly. So they had like catered breakfast, lunch, dinner, all of that stuff. There was a variety of speakers there that did a great job. And in fact, I actually found it exciting that there was a couple of speakers that when I attended their lectures, I was like, I don't have a fucking clue about any of this. Which I don't know if you kind of run into this where if you've been in the fitness space enough, you hear the same things over and over and over again, which isn't invaluable. Sometimes it's nice to hear different versions of the same thing, but to be exposed to something within the health and fitness space where it's like, I'm completely out of my depth here, I actually found quite exciting. It gives me kind of a direction for things that I want to learn. Mm-hmm. I was also very lucky that I attended it with two friends of mine who are coaches as well, which made it kind of a fun experience to be able to bounce some of those ideas and stuff off of one another. I'm sure people can hear my voice. I did get a cold, which has taken forever to get over. One thing kind of actually on that note, and then I want to hear you guys talk about some programming stuff, and maybe this leads into it a little bit. One thing that we talk about a lot in our course is like the power of like maintenance volumes, or essentially just like how little you can actually train and maintain your muscularity in particular, but like your fitness level. Mm-hmm. So in being sick and travel and all this other stuff, I've essentially trained twice in the last 12 days, which I normally I've trained 6 days a week, every week for fucking years. So this is probably the least I've trained in a period of time in a very, very, very long period of time. And obviously, I'm going to be training today, which is the first time in a while. I'm going to be very weak feeling and it's going to feel a little bit foreign. But I'm essentially the exact same body weight. I'm maybe a couple pounds lighter. Instead of 255, I'm like 250, which is not that big of a difference. And it's mainly just because I'm also not eating as much because I know I'm not training as much. Mm-hmm. But like I don't look like all my gains didn't disappear over a 2-week period of time, which I know is something people get afraid of. So I think, just putting an asterisk beside like my own lived experience right now is like I have barely fucking trained the last couple of weeks and it's going to be completely fine. If anything, not being an idiot and try to train when I'm trying to recover from being sick and actually giving my body an opportunity to rest and recover in the long run will probably be the right decision.
No doubt. And actually your point about maintenance volume is really great. And that's definitely something that I think will be relevant to our conversation that's coming up. To put a little bow on the Real Coaches Summit anecdote or segment of today, what is different about it, like that you really appreciated?
I think the biggest thing is how personal it is. So like the presenters are fantastic, don't get me wrong, but I think you can find that at nearly any conference or fitness education event. They'll often have fantastic presenters and lecturers, but not only did Aram do a great job, I mentioned that the essentially catered meals that he had, which is really unique, but there was like essentially a dining / meeting hall for everybody. So you had this opportunity to mingle with not only the other, attendees, but all the lecturers ate there as well. So if you wanted to, we've had him on here before, but like Nick Shaw is a buddy of mine, as well as Crystal. Just had a chance to, like, I walked 10 feet over and we sat and like ate some food and chatted with each other and caught up. And you have this opportunity that I think sometimes there's like a greater divide between the presenters and then the people who are in the audience. This felt a little bit like summer camp for trainers, but to me, that was something that was really cool
in a great way. Yeah.
In a great way. Like there was there was essentially no hierarchy. And, even there was a couple of booths for, like, there was an apparel company and a supplement company and stuff like that. And they were having lunch with us too. And you just had it was cool. Like, there was kind of this, it was a little bit like fitness kumbaya. But it was something that I thought it obviously, Aram leads from the front in that sense. He's an extremely personable guy. And I think that DNA is, integrated in the whole event from top to bottom. So to me, that was the thing that made it really unique. All the other aspects of what you'd want from a conference, was great. I definitely touched base with some individuals that I'm really intrigued by some of the things that they presented, and I want to learn more. Hopefully we'll get some of them as guests on here as well. But I think it was an event that I walked away from where I felt like I was a part of it as opposed to just witnessing it, if that makes sense.
Beautiful.
Very cool.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely an event that I plan on being at next year, not only from what I've heard from you, but also from our conversation that we had with Aram. I think it was like 2.5 months ago at this point that we had it, but recently released, like you touched on. So I appreciate you putting an asterisk on that. And, for the traders that are listening, or even the enthusiasts that are listening that are, that description that Ryan painted, if that sounded interesting to you, definitely encourage you to go check that out. Just keep your eyes peeled on Instagram, etc., or follow Real Coaches Summit for more information. Today, primary topic. We're doing pretty good. We are at 32 minutes, transitioning into primary topic of the day, which is strength training and periodization considerations for endurance athletes. I have a few notes here. That being said, Brett, I'd like to pass the baton to you. Is there anything when it comes to this topic that you'd like to lead us off with today, whether it be something you'd like to share, a question, anything like that?
Here's my hot take for the day. I think endurance athletes should do strength training. Maybe not such a hot take, actually. But I feel like that's like an important part to start with the discussion. If we're going to start with the Vince Lombardi, this is a football speech, is like the foundation of this conversation is that endurance athletes should be doing some level of strength training. I think it's really important, not just for like muscles, but obviously like joint health and everything, creating some strength and some resilience through there. And then performance, I think, is going to improve as well.
Yeah, I love that. And, interestingly, and I wish I had the paper in front of me. I don't, but I'll see if I can find it, where they did a study looking at efficiency of endurance runners specifically, which of course, I think maybe it's worth mentioning that, I think today, within the context of today's conversation, I'm probably largely going to talk about running as the primary kind of endurance sport. This applies also to all other forms of endurance sport as well. And they looked at efficiency improvements in runners in this one study. And it was a relatively short cohort. And the performance improvements that those folks saw was either the same or greater than the performance improvements that people see from wearing like super shoes with like carbon plates and stuff like that. And like shoes that like literally have like springs built into them. Folks that did strength training saw the either same or better improvements in terms of efficiency. And the even cooler thing about it is that strength training doesn't just affect efficiency, right? It affects a whole bunch of other things, a whole bunch of other metrics that are non-specific to running, like health metrics, mental health, etc. Now, of course, mean, super shoes can also affect your mental health if you have like a maybe like a not the greatest relationship with spending. What is it? Uh, what's it called when people like go spend money because they're like depressed or something like that?
Retail therapy.
Retail therapy. That's the word. Yeah. Yeah. So
The irony that
super
I know
shoes,
that when I'm like the cheapest dude ever, like I don't buy anything.
that
Buy
is
my
right.
shoes
That
off
is right.
Amazon.
Yeah. That's your retail therapy, right?
I
Sorry,
remember
Brad, I cut you off.
I did the Toronto Waterfront Half Marathon probably like 15 years ago. And I remember tooting out of the start and seeing this woman who is like decked out. She's got like the visor, $200 glasses on. She's got like the elbow sleeves, the like compression socks, $250 shoes. And she's ripping right along. I'm like, nice. And then like maybe 4K in, I see her like on the side of the road. It's just sucking wind, hands on her feet or on her knees. It's like maybe a little too much retail therapy
Yeah,
in
for
that
sure.
case.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's I think that like gear is important, but I always like to focus a bit more on like the training side of things, and then just kind of use that as my metric. Like if I'm always training in minimalist shoes, then my measurement stick is me in minimalist shoes, and not necessarily anything with like a carbon plate or anything that's going to affect my performance that much. Because I'm more measuring myself versus myself. Like I'm not trying to hit particular like big markers compared to others. But I know my training is very different. Like I do strength training, but I want to be strong and I want to be a good endurance athlete. It's not like my strength training is purely to fuel my endurance training, which I know for a lot of people it is.
So I have
Yeah.
some questions for you guys.
Sure.
I know this is a huge shock for everybody, but I'm not an endurance athlete. But, just based on, in general, like my understanding of, I'll just say sport training or strength and conditioning training, I can make some inferences, but I want to like see what you guys think about this. And if there are answers that are more unique, let's say particularly to running or other endurance sports. Because when I think about the integration of, I'll just say strength training in general into sport, how it differs from, I'll just say barbell sports or fitness sports like bodybuilding, powerlifting, etc., is in those sports, the lifting essentially is the sport. It is the skill. So there isn't kind of this dichotomy of training for the skill of the sport as well as training for the supporting strength, etc.
Sure.
So obviously there's going to be a certain degree of, fatigue management where you don't want your weight training to interfere, or at least not significantly interfere with, let's just say your runs that you're doing. The thing that I'm curious about and that I want to know what your guys' input is on this, to what degree are you specific with the strength training? So I've seen some people where they'll be very general, where it's like, if you just improve your squat, if you just improve like an overhead press or a push press, like very, very, very general levels of strength are going to yield results in sport performance. Or would you be specific enough where you might look at the individual components? Like I think of something like, if you look at like gait, like my ankle is going to have a certain degree of, like there's going to be a certain degree of pronation. Are you training pronation in the gym? Are you training, the knee being in valgus because that's going to happen when you're single leg? Or is it a lot more general? Like I'm curious from your perspective, like how specific or how general would the strength training components for endurance training be?
It's a really good question. Brett, what do you think?
I'm definitely more of a generalist, I think. Like I'm going to start from a point of like, let's just stick with the basics and work on that stuff. It'll go kind of individual by individual. Like I've mentioned before, my client who is a bit of a runner, also a doctor and working a really stressful job, often has pain and tightness in her hip flexors. So we've started trying to train specifically the strength of those hip flexors. Obviously, like, a bit of stretching and mobility is a part of it too, but we've seen some good success doing like loaded hip flexion. which is, I wouldn't necessarily throw at another random fit or random runner who might come into my door. Or if somebody's got some plantar fasciitis or some, bottom of the foot issues, maybe we're going to do some more calf raises in the program. But it definitely starting with like a very, very general thing, because I think there's a lot to be gained, especially for a lot of like running folk don't do a lot of lifting. And, if they have, it's, lunges with 20 pounders in their hands. So like getting them on an actual heavy lifting program is going to be very new. And I think there's a lot of meat on the bone for those, or juice to squeeze, as you guys like to say.
Mm-hmm. I agree, man. I think, to answer your question, Rye, of like, to what degree am I specific with strength training? I'm tissue and structure specific. I think that there's a big mistake that people make in the sport training world. But if we talk very specifically about running, is people try to mimic, gait, and they do things that look like you're running in the context of the gym, which essentially just ends up being a shitty stimulus when it comes to the specificity of running. And it ends up being also usually a shitty tissue stimulus as well. So generally speaking, what I do consider is I look at things from a tissue / like joint structure specific lens. You used the example of pronation and knee valgus earlier, which reminded me of this quote by Alec Blennis, which was, I'm going to butcher the quote because I don't have it in front of me, but he said something along the lines of like, there isn't really such a thing as good and bad form, but rather how you move it tells me essentially just where you're going to break down, which I very much agree. You look at like when you go into certain positions, certain tissues get loaded. That's just kind of how it is, right? If you do a certain exercise that biases a certain muscle or connective tissue in contrast to another, certain tissues are biased in exercise A that aren't in B, and vice versa. And any exercise done with excessive volume for a given person, any exercise, whether it be spinal flexion, knee valgus, knee varus, spinal extension, spinal rotation, it doesn't matter. Elbow flexion, it doesn't fucking matter. Any exercise done with excess volume in relation to the person will lead to either sensitization and or injury. And so we can look at how people perform exercises and be like, okay, what are the dominant ways in which they are stressing their bodies? And how can we maybe prepare those tissues to a greater degree to, as some people use this kind of this cup analogy, like a cup that overflows is kind of like representative of pain, where you can, through strength training, loading specific tissues, maybe you can build a bigger cup so that your capacity is greater. So for instance, like I have a few runners that I work with who, when they run, they pronate till the cows come home. And there's a lot of cows in Switzerland. And so like we purposefully bring them into positions where like their knee is like really far towards the inside. We are putting a lot of strain on the tissues that are loaded when you pronate, as a means of hopefully strengthening tissue, maybe. But even if that's not happening, because you don't necessarily see, that's another thing that's kind of interesting. I was listening to a Greg Lehman podcast recently. He was talking about how it's like, it doesn't actually seem like you need to get stronger for tissues to become less sensitive. So if we put the notion that you're strengthening things kind of aside, because that doesn't necessarily seem to be 100% true all the time, but just by doing controlled stressing of the area, it seems like you can lead to a net desensitization of the area. Through which mechanism, we don't fully understand it. And so to answer your question of to what degree am I specific with strength training, I'm specific within the context of like, what are the stresses associated to the sport? And how can we hopefully, through strategic exercise selection, prepare the body by loading those areas, either in preparatory blocks of training or concurrently during, even like concurrently during their training. And then the other piece I'll mention is also just deficits. So like if you're always in a certain position, like sometimes training the body and doing the opposite stuff can be therapeutic in terms of pain reduction, and also sometimes can be synergistic and actually potentiate further performance as well. Anecdotally, I've noticed that. I didn't mean to cut you off, Ryan. What were you going to say?
No, I've got a couple of questions, but I don't know if I've shared this on here before. I know I've shared it with somebody. So when we were talking about the hyper sport specific training, which I think we all probably agree generally isn't like a great idea. You know, I'm thinking of like people shooting a med ball to practice being a good jump shooter or something. There was a study done years ago, because I remember I was still at Good Life when I first read it. And they took, I think they were collegiate level sprinters, and they took some of them and they had them run with parachutes, and then they had whatever their control group was. You know, very standard practice, especially like you see this on like football training, like very old school, like, or throw a tire on your back and run, whatever. And what they found was the sprint times for these high level sprinters actually decreased with the like wind resisted sprinting, because to accommodate for the extra load, their sprint stride changed, and it became less specific to the sport that they're actually competing in. So I think that, you know, be warned when you try to combine skill training and resistance training into one thing. I think just keep them separate entirely. You know, I always think of like, if you are a trainer or a strength and conditioning coach, your job is to get people stronger and is to get them more conditioned. They have skill coaches for their sport. So don't wear all those hats.
Man, and you know, it's like if we were to use a different example of like, let's say Formula One, like a trainer builds the car. You have other people that will work on like the mental game of the athlete. You have simulators where they practice the timing of going around corners, etc. As the mechanic, that's not your job. Like, you know, and so I very much agree. Very much agree with you. I did
have two questions for you guys, if you don't mind. So the first, so A, you know, I know there's probably common, whether it be chronic or acute injuries that maybe runners run into. Would there be any means of potentially mitigating some of that injury risk that you might sort of try to accomplish through their strength training? And then B, if you had, you know, let's say somebody is peaking for a race in the summer, how would you periodize their running as well as their resistance training throughout a year?
Cool. Good questions. First one was, remind me again.
So essentially, like, you know, common injuries that you might see with runners, and then how would you potentially mitigate the risk of those through resistance training?
So big ones I've seen over and over again, like patellar stuff, you know, tendinosis, tendinitis, like sensitization around the patellar tendon, Achilles, and the bottom of the foot, and kind of plantar fasciitis, if we're going to call it that. And I mean, like just like three major joints of the low body, right? And being a generalist, like if we haven't run into any of those issues yet, I think that general strength training are going to hit most of those areas. And as I mentioned before, if I've got somebody who's come in with something specific, like I have had my left knee give me issues as soon as my running, you know, I get up above 40K a week, my left knee, my left patellar tendon is always giving me issues. Then we might dial in a little bit more into that and do some kind of more like, you know, single leg, slow movements and try to like load that patella in a healthy way, and hopefully cause some adaptations and or, you know, desensitization of the tissues.
Good. And then, so, and then your second question there, right, was also around like race prep, right? How to?
Yeah. And essentially like how might you periodize it over the course of a year?
Awesome. All right. So Brett, I'll jump in with your, you know, to kind of like piggyback off of what you're saying. So mitigating against common injuries for runners, what are the common injuries? And then also injury mitigation strategies. Common injuries, Like Brett mentioned, absolutely bang on ankle, foot. So plantar fasciitis, Achilles stuff. Calf strains also can happen. Bone stress fractures in the foot and the tibia. And then so that's all kind of beneath, below the knee. At the knee itself, usually it's going to be more so patellar tendon related. But you do sometimes see folks that will get like some meniscal irritation as well, because there are like significant impact forces going through the menisci. And then less common are hip. Usually it's like a bursitis. Excuse me. One sec. That's better. Didn't want to do that on air. That would have been rough. So normally it's like a bursitis thing, but I would say far less common in volume than foot/lower leg and then going to the knee. And I would argue you'll see probably more volume beneath the knee than at the knee, and then more at the knee than at the hip. I would view it as probably being that way. I don't have data to support that, but that would be my guess, just because there's going to be more load going through those areas proportionately. So now in terms of like mitigating injury risk, honestly, the first thing to consider is just going to be like general load management. Like if we're not even talking about strength training, you could have the perfect running technique. And if your rate of progression is such that it's just too much, you're probably going to either injure tissue, or there's going to be some sensitivity that's going to develop. So
that's a really good point. A lot of people will be like, I want to get into running. I'm going to do a 5K today. And it's like, oh boy, no.
Man, yeah. Like I looked at like one of my clients I'm currently working with right now, who's crushing it with his training. When we first started, which I think was like maybe 6 or 7 months ago, he was just like, I don't want to have any more foot pain. And maybe if I could get back into running, that'd be great. And I was like, cool, man, let's see how it goes. And we, within essentially a week, we started getting him running again. But we just did so ultra gradually, because when I looked at like during the intake, like when I looked at like, how has he reintegrated running into his life? Because that was a sport that he really liked. Like you said, Brett, he'd be like, oh yeah, I'm just going to like go for an easy 5. And it's like, bro, like, if you walk too much, it hurts you, and walking too much, like, I don't know, 6,000 or 7,000 steps a day. Like his foot wasn't really adapted to being able to tolerate a huge amount of stress, let alone from walking. You slap on doing a 5K in non-supportive footwear, because that's what he was told that he needed. The holistic, like the total stress of that for him was mega. So
can I interject? Actually, you said something there
Sure.
that maybe, like, I'd love to hear your opinions on it. There seems to be like an attack against supportive footwear for running. Like I remember when the Minimalist shoe became incredibly popular and sort of burst on the scene, it was all the rage. And there was a lot of conversation around, people putting their feet in foot jail. Can you, maybe talk about like why you might wear supportive footwear when you're running?
Yeah, I'm seeing the pendulum kind of start to swing in the other direction now, actually. A lot of people are going to like these like maximalist, like Hokas. And I don't think there's anything necessarily evil about either. But I think we got to take personal preference into account. I don't know. Etienne, I'll let you speak on this a little bit.
Sure, man. Yeah. I mean, I think it's like a lot of the things that we talk about in our courses. We need to just view this from an emotionally neutral perspective, in contrast to getting sucked into belief camps about which one is better or worse. I think that's fundamentally the issue, in contrast to just viewing it as being like, what might be the right tool for the job. Hammers are great at hammering. Screwdrivers are good at screwdrivering. Trumpets are good at trumpeting. Use them all. Like, use 3 different things for 3 different tools, or 3 different outcomes, depending on what you're looking for. So I think if we view this as being kind of like from a cost benefit analysis perspective, minimalist footwear have certain benefits, and they also challenge the body in certain ways that are different than a maximalist shoe. And maximalist shoe, it's the opposite. So it really is exclusively, it's kind of an unsexy answer, but it's just like which one is going to best suit your goals. When I first started getting into running, this was, I don't know, when was this? October of 2022, I think, was when I set the goal to do the marathon in 2023. Was it that? I think so. Yes. And I gave myself the objective of being the most jacked guy to cross the finish line at 190 pounds in minimalist footwear, running a sub 4-hour marathon. That was my objective. And so I started training. I did my first initial runs in Vivos. And within about a week, with ultra low training volume, I started to develop really serious sensitivity in my Achilles, I think on my right side or my left. I can't remember. It may have actually been bilateral. I'm not sure. And I was just like, fucking hell. All right. Well, and this was quite literally, without exaggerating, this was like maybe 2 or 3 weeks into this journey. I had a year of training ahead of me. And I was very deconditioned to the stresses of running. And so I just kind of asked myself, like, what matters more? Is it being able to accomplish this goal, or like, am I really, really attached to the minimalist footwear piece? And so for me, it was more important to be able to accumulate the necessary training volume, and to like have a good experience during the whole build. And so I ended up going to a store and bought not a maximalist shoe, but something that had a little bit of a drop. So a drop makes reference to the difference in height between the heel and the forefoot. So I got, I think, a 5 millimeter drop shoe was the initial one that I got, which is still quite low for a lot of shoes. Like, I think the average Saucony or an ASIC has like, I think it's like 12, like 10 to 12 is the kind of average. And sometimes they go higher, and there's things below 5 as well, but I digress. And immediately running in that eliminated the Achilles sensitivity that I had. And it allowed me to move forward with the build, without the weak link of the Achilles, and, so the first point I would say is that it's just a tool. I think the question is just which one is going to better suit your objectives. The second piece, kind of along this line, is like when I'm purposefully trying to train my lower leg to like hopefully develop increased capacity and tolerance within the whole plantar flexor chain, you could say. When I'm training it at the gym, I'm in more minimalist footwear because I find that it allows for a little bit more motion of the foot, and it allows me to drive what I find is a better local stimulus than if I'm trying to do like a heel raise in a Hoka, like Brett was saying, which is like ultra cushioned, and then the other thing as well that's kind of interesting that a lot of running coaches are advocating for is actually variety in your footwear, so that your foot doesn't become a specialist. Like, have something that has less of a drop, which generally speaking, lower drop shoes will increase the stress on the plantar flexor group and decrease it on the knee generally. And then also have something that maybe has a little bit more of a drop that's going to decrease the stress on the plantar flexor group and increase it on the knee. And then you can use those two as a means of rotating your tires, so to speak, during your training. So that way, if when you're training, let's say you start reaching the limit of what your plantar flexors are comfortable with, you adopt a higher drop shoe for a week, just offload those tissues a little bit and load other tissues a little bit more. It allows you to keep going, keep building the aerobic engine. And then, if ever your knees start to become a little bit sensitive or what have you, you can change your stride or you can change your shoe. So that's something that a lot of people are using strategically within their periodization as a means of potentiating longevity. So it really doesn't seem to be better or worse. It's just more so what's going to be the right tool for the job. And also personal preference.
Yeah,
like if you feel better in a high drop shoe, fucking have at it, Go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah. I since I've been running in minimalist shoes, I just find them so much more comfortable for me. Like I used to have a lot of blister problems with other shoes, and I don't know if that may be a relation to my enormous feet, or if it's just the shoes I was buying. But since switching, I haven't had as many issues. I definitely notice if I've taken a break from running, it takes me longer to build up that capacity. I'd probably be able to get to a certain volume in maybe half the time if I was wearing a big, thick soled shoe. But for me, I don't like, it doesn't hold me back that much. I kind of enjoy the process. The other thing is, I think it's been good for my running mechanics in just in terms of like a nice, efficient and quiet stride, and not just kind of pounding the pavement. Like I can hear it when I'm running in minimalist shoes. Like I sound lighter at 235 than people I run with who are like 130. And I hope that's good in general in terms for my running mechanics than wasting a lot of energy just slapping the ground.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally.
So I'm curious, and actually this might be a good question for Ryan. If you were to ever train a runner, I realize you had another question in there. We'll
it's all good. It's all good. Go for it.
This kind of flows into it though. If you had a runner, how would you generally do like a weekly programming? Let's say they're doing like 4 running days a week and that's their focus. Where would you think to slot in strength training amongst that? Like, let's say they've got a variety of runs. They've got a short and fast one. They've got a medium and medium one, and they've got a long and slow one and a recovery run. Like, where naturally would you think to slot in, a heavy leg day or an upper body day compared to those runs? I'm curious to someone who's got less experience in running, but a lot of experience training.
Mm-hmm. So it's funny you asked that. I actually have a client who I'm kind of going through this right now. So his main goal is to get on stage, ballpark 2 years from now. And weight training is what he really likes to do, but he loves running and cycling as well. So he actually has a race May 7th or something. I can't remember the exact date. May 4th. Doesn't matter.
Is it the Ottawa race weekend or?
No, he's in Vancouver.
Oh, cool. Okay.
So now for the most part, because he was sort of running ahead of time. And when I first took him on, we sort of discussed how much he cared about his running performance versus bodybuilding performance, because that obviously sways where the volume, like the overall weekly volume of activity, is going to get allocated. You're going to do more of the thing that you care about. If he cared more about running, we'd allocate more effort there and live with the fact that there just is less stimulus resistance training wise. The inverse of that is true. One of the big things we honestly did was drop one of his leg training sessions out. So he had a relatively standard, I say standard, like if you were to look at his weight training program, looked like a kind of stereotypical bodybuilding program. We pulled a leg training session out as a means of just managing his recovery as we get closer to the race. To answer your question, essentially I would keep the leg training session and then whatever the highest demand run is as far away from each other as possible, just so there's less of like an interference effect. Mm-hmm. And then, whatever his highest demand run would be on like an upper session where that recovery isn't going to interfere with each other quite as much. Obviously, systemically, there's going to be they're going to impede one another to some degree. And it's, I think, a matter of just living with whatever those trade-offs are. Mm-hmm. In his case, because it's a very short-term goal, it's not something I'm really worried about planning out for months and, for the full year or something like that. We're just sort of pulling back on some of his resistance training volume. We're actually going to deload his leg training entirely the week before. He's going to do his race, and then he's sort of done running in any kind of challenging capacity after that. But really, to me, the biggest thing is just looking at like, where are the biggest stressors? What's the priority as well? Because you can only recover from so much. And then as best as you can, try to slot those together to not have them interfere with one another. Obviously, if he squats really, really heavy and then, or I should, squats really heavy, does a lot of leg volume and then has to do a 15K run the same day, like that's probably not going to go very well. If I can separate those two by 3 or 4 days, that's probably the best we can do in those conditions. I don't know, ET, if you've got thoughts on that as well.
I totally agree, except anecdotally, I will share something that has surprised me and my coach, which is, so yes, to everything you said in terms of minimizing interference and being strategic in terms of putting harder lower body training as far away as you can in the, in the training week, I guess you could say. But interestingly, I have found that lower body strength training, specifically with the intent of like power production, so lifting heavy without accumulating a lot of fatigue, interestingly has actually been in many ways a potentiator, done same day and also the day before. Like I've had some of my like best track days were on the same day that I did heavy front squats. And
would you get like a PAP effect from that?
I don't know if it's, I mean, yeah, you could probably put it into that category. Yeah.
Because my thought would be,
can we define
typically
PAP?
So post-activation potentiation. Mm-hmm. So typically what you'll see is when people do like a heavy load set of something, because there's a certain level of nervous system excitation required to like have that orchestration to move the load, you get this kind of effect for later sets where, because the nervous system is so prepared to be able to move something heavy, you typically see an improvement in performance and force mm-hmm. production after the fact. My mm-hmm. only curiosity would be, and this is not to diminish the anecdotal effect, I'm just, anecdotal evidence that you had. I'm just really curious the mechanism, because if there's a potentiation effect, typically like post-activation potentiation is a relatively short window. Mm-hmm. So I'd be curious what the underlying mechanism would be as to why like doing something, it's obviously in some way has to be related to just the ability for the nervous system to orchestrate all of those like muscle fibers firing in a way to produce force.
Hey man, we muscle fibers, we be fibrin.
Those fibrin, man.
Yeah, well, this is why I said we could maybe put it in the category of post-activation potentiation, but I don't actually think it's traditional PAP for that reason, because traditional PAP tends to be more short-lived. I've been doing, as of late, a little bit more of a deep dive on tendon rehab, because I'm kind of just fascinated on trying to better understand what's going on there. And plot twist, the experts have no idea what's going on. So that's satisfying. But one of the things that some of these guys have been talking about is that seemingly if you can hit the Goldilocks zone of tendon stress, and we have no idea what that is. Like, it seems like for some people, it's kind of like a strain of the tendon, meaning a deformation lengthwise of the tendon that's like in the vicinity of, I think, anywhere from like 4 to 7% in certain tendons, and in other tendons, it's maybe closer to 10 or 12. It's from my understanding currently, which is very limited, it's hard to say. But there's been a few of the people that I've been looking into in podcasts and looking at like what they've written, where they're talking about how seemingly strength training can have a little bit of a resetting effect also when it comes to sensitivity. Mechanistically, we have no idea. But interestingly, it seems to have that kind of subjective effect on folks. And for me, that is, I think, the potentiator of performance from my own kind of felt lived experience. Because when I do, for instance, like heavy front squats or, exercises that have like a decent amount of like knee extensor load, my knees just feel juicy, like not just for a day, but they feel juicy for like a few days. And that sensation is also a potentiator of performance for me, not only with higher intensity training sessions, but also with like my longer kind of like moderate intensity runs as well. It's like my body is just like sensitivity gets calibrated. And once again, mechanistically, I don't know. And the folks that I'm learning from, the people that are like studying this shit, also have no idea mechanistically what's going on. So, long story short, that's why I said that I don't think it's a traditional post activation potentiation effect because of how time bound that is. But it is a potentiation effect post activation. But I think it might be via alternate mechanisms.
I do think something you said there is worth touching on as well, because, you know, for the most part, we've been talking about managing training volumes. So, you know, I was even talking about my client within the context of, you know, bodybuilding training, you're going to have just more volume in general for tissues that you have to recover from. But there are other aspects of programming to consider. So I think of, again, like if we look at sport training in season versus out of season, you can't have athletes going on the field where their quads and their glutes are beat up and they can't run or they can't hit somebody. But how do you sustain the, you know, level of muscle that they have? How do you sustain some of the training adaptations that they've made in the off season? Well, a lot of that can be done with like high load, low volume training, because that's going to be really stimulative to the nervous system and not have the same type of recovery demands in those tissues that therefore aren't going to interfere with their sport performance. So I think that that's something that is also important to talk about. I think this is something where, you know, the pendulum swings in different directions, you know, every couple of years. I think bodybuilding right now is quite popular. Obviously, I'm pretty immersed in that sport as well. But I think the problem is then the conversations around training tend to just revolve around that. Like, so people just think of weight training as being like bodybuilding training.
Sets of 10, 12 done to failure.
Sets 10, 12, exactly. But the thing is like there are a wide variety of sports that use resistance training to improve sport performance that are not necessarily about maximizing like muscular size. You know, Brett, I'm kind of looking at you because you have a football background. Like the way that a football player is going to train in season versus out of season is completely different. I think of hockey, you know, I played hockey growing up, especially because, you know, football, you're playing, I know you're practicing multiple times throughout the week, but you've got one game a week. Hockey, you've got 3 maybe. Like where in there can you fit traditional quote unquote bodybuilding training, especially for the lower body? You know, you're going to absolutely sacrifice sport performance on the ice. But if you look at a lot of their training, and I think, again, I'd be really curious about your guys' thoughts on this. I've seen criticisms around certain, you know, you see this on Instagram where people like, look how stupid these athletes train. Sometimes it's fair. Like I've seen the LeBron 1/8 squatting, and I really wonder what that's about. But like if I'm LeBron's strength and conditioning coach, first of all, the worst thing I can possibly do is get LeBron hurt. So I think that's something that gets integrated into their like training process. But if I've got LeBron in the middle of a season, or if I've got, you know, Brady Kachuk in the middle of a season, whatever it happens to be, if LeBron's got to play 35 minutes a game and jump and like be in a defensive stance, and he's doing ass to grass squats for sets of 8 to 10
to failure,
how it's going to be fucked. Like he's not going to be able to play.
Yeah.
So much of what I have to do in season with him is like, yes, I need to have him training and uphold some kind of level of fitness. But the worst thing that I can do is give him a ton of soreness and a ton of eccentric loading. So this is where I think people will see things like, again, football, you see this a lot, is like hang cleans and stuff like that, where there's basically there's no eccentric loading at all. You're probably not going to get a lot of muscle damage from that. And I would say if you're talking about, in my opinion, is a hang clean the absolute best exercise to build a ton of mass and a ton of strength? Probably not. Could I see it having a useful place in season for somebody that needs to get some weight in their hands and produce some force and not have it interfere with game day? Like, I think that you could make a solid argument there.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I ran into a blog years ago. This is kind of like semi-related to what you're talking about. This was from a guy who competed in powerlifting competitions and Ironmans, which, if you're not aware, is like an absurdly long endurance sport. Like, you know, a good time is 13 hours, like, or 12 hours. Like, it's a crazy, two crazy things. Probably, like, I don't know if there's much more opposite ends of the spectrum. And how to train for them. And interestingly, he paired up his most intense, not in terms of volume, but like high intensity, low volume days with his longest endurance events. The idea being that he's using, you know, fast twitch fibers in a very, very different energy system than he is on his like super, super long ones. And I've definitely incorporated that into my training. You know, if you can, you know, put it alongside your recovery day or like as far away from your long training day as you can. If you can't, your next best option is to like put your most intense quick movement day next to your like really long endurance day.
Yeah. There's a lot of power in contrast, man. That's one thing, like, you know, I wrote down some notes here. But like the having really significant contrasts in training for endurance athletes seems to be really, really, really useful. And one of the reasons being is that what you were talking about there, Brett, you know, really high intensity, low volume, and thus, pardon me, low fatigue work has like the benefit of like either maintaining performance, maybe nudging it, without the kind of the cost of fatigue, which you know, like I was kind of talking about earlier. Like I've noticed that myself. You know, like I mentioned, there was some days where I did like heavy like front squats, you know, triples, like 6 sets of 3 with like an ass load of rest in between, and then went to the track that night and like was like felt top notch. And I did that just because I had to get creative with my schedule to fit what I wanted into my training diet to kind of make it fit in my life. And I kind of stumbled upon how like, oh, this is odd. I feel it's not that I just feel okay. I feel really good when I do this. That's interesting. And yeah, and so thank you for validating me there, Brett. That's really great. I don't know if you did that on purpose, but I appreciate that. And you know, it's one of the things. So we went on a bunch of tangents, which I think were really useful. And I'd like to, if it's cool with you guys, I'd like to bring it back to the earlier, Rye. You asked 2 questions: mitigating risk of injury for runners, and then also race prep, which I think will be a good way to kind of bleed into some of the notes that I prepared for this evening. For those that are interested in kind of like strength training and periodization for endurance athletes, I think that this will be a really nice lead into kind of like some major points. Of course, there's more. This is non-exhaustive, but if you guys are cool with it, I'd like to lead us there, unless there's something else that you guys want to pull on from what we were talking about.
No, that's great.
Okay. So your question, Raya, of like, you know, race prep, how to, like over the course of a year, generally from a very reductionist perspective, there's 2 phases. Phase 1 is the largest: build the engine. So you just are building capacity. You're building tissue capacity and you're building the aerobic engine. And the way that works, this is usually what people will call base training in like the endurance world, where you're looking to do a variety of competencies. So you'll do, like Brett was talking about, like maybe in your week you have like a long run, then maybe you have a recovery run, and then you have some speed work. And essentially kind of looking to kind of check a variety of boxes, taxes the body in how would I say, in varying ways, because interestingly, like the aerobic and anaerobic systems, it's not on off. There's a relationship between aerobic and anaerobic and vice versa. And like having like an efficient aerobic system, potentiates anaerobic and vice versa. And so developing both is really important. One of the big rate limiters to that is usually going to be tissue capacity, which is something that we're going to kind of, I think, likely come back to in a moment. But generally speaking, like over the course of like, let's say a 12-month build, probably around 9 months is base. Meaning like, how can we build general aerobic capacity? How can we have some speed work in there? And how can we just kind of not do too much too fast too soon and honor what is like the rate of progression that the athlete seems to be able to sustain. Now, this is increasingly complicated and the water gets a little bit muddled or muddy, both muddy, muddled water when folks have varying levels of allostatic load and, you know, training isn't their bread-winning activity, and maybe they have relationship stress and those types of things. So it's very, very dynamic. The target moves in space and you have to try to hit it. So once again, build the engine is phase one. And then the second block of that is just get specific. So then, for instance, within the context of a marathon during the year, you're looking to just build as much capacity and speed as you can. You're looking to also build one's tolerance, like psychological tolerance to fatigue, which is an adaptation that people don't often talk about in the endurance world, but I would argue it's probably one of the primary ones. And then within maybe 3-ish months, you then start to get specific with like increasingly long runs that might be on the day of the event. So if you know your race is going to be on a Sunday at 7 a.m. local time, you would gradually start putting the longer runs on Sundays. And then you might also start getting more specific with the time of day that you go for your longer run as a means of like getting in reps. So the first time you do that isn't on race day. And then the other piece that's really important, honestly, is nutrition. Like nutrition in endurance sports kind of makes or breaks things. So like you need to figure out what type of fueling strategy is going to work for you, which products your gut and your palate tolerates. Like for instance, there's a gel that my gut likes, but like I'm gagging it down. And it's a gel called Martins. I don't know if you've heard of that one, Brett. So anyways, it's like a flavorless gel. It's watery, but not, you kind of have to chew it. And it's just kind of sweet. It's gross.
Just glucose jizz.
You went there. But honestly, man, it's disgusting. And
we were all thinking it.
Like the first time I tried it, I was like, oh, this isn't too bad. And then my second session, I was like, fuck me. Like this is I would take a breath and then like slam, chew, gulp it down. Like don't let it stay in the mouth. Just hammer it back because it's gag-inducing.
Lime chaser, put some salt in your mouth first.
That's right. Yeah. Or just lick your own hand because you got a lot of salt on you, right? So that's a piece of specificity that also comes into play, especially in like the last quarter of the year. You really need to dial that in. And because if you don't, your performance will in some way, shape, or form, either a little bit or a lot, will crash and burn on the day. So those are my thoughts with regards to race prep. Did you guys have any questions or things you guys want to add to that?
No, I like that. It kind of sums it up nicely, wraps a bow on this whole thing.
Sick. All right. Do you guys need to jet, or can I get into a few of my other points?
Go for it, man.
Brett, how you doing?
Mm-hmm.
All right. So major themes that I wrote down here with regards to the strength training piece and also just general periodization in terms of just major considerations. First and foremost is specificity. like we've talked about on so many different occasions, like what you're training for matters. So for instance, do you have a primary event in the year? And also, what are the demands of that thing? So for instance, my primary event this year is to survive my trail run. That's essentially the focus. I have a marathon in essentially 3 weeks. The marathon isn't my A race or my primary event of the year. And so as much as I want to push myself on this, I need to remember to not like compromise the rest of the journey for the sake of having a good marathon time, because it just isn't the priority. So as much as I would like to beat 4 hours, my primary focus is to complete it, push myself, and be injury free. That's number one. And the larger context is what determines that approach. The other piece of that, of course, is, like with when it comes to specificity, the trail event is going to be run in different footwear. So I eventually need to start conditioning my feet to a slightly more minimalist trail shoe. And I'm also going to need to get in a lot more volume on hills. So increasingly, as my training progresses, there's going to be things where it's going to be like not just hill repeats, but it's going to be like find a hike that has at least 1,000 meters of elevation gain and go do that on the weekend. So like that'll be like a part of my training as well. And then last but not least, which is kind of associated to all of this stuff, is considering like tissue specific demands and then also like time demands. So for instance, with regards to trail, there's a lot more load concentrically on the plantar flexor chain, right? So if we're talking about like calf endurance, calf strength, really important. But then also like the thing that really fucks with people in trail is the downhills, like the eccentric load through your quads, just obliterates people. Like you'll see, and I actually did it also, you'll see people going downhill, like if their knees are smoked, they'll be going down the mountain backwards just to like give their knees a break, because it's really difficult. And so like challenging the body and hopefully fostering increased capacity, like in the need to be able to tolerate those stresses is important. And you can do that by getting outside and doing faster descents. And you can also do it with just like lots of knee extensor load, lots of eccentric load as well in a controlled environment in the gym, which is something that's going to be a part of my training as well. So specificity is kind of number one. The second and third points are kind of interchangeable, because I think it's all kind of the same thing or similar, which is rate of progression, honoring the rate of progression of the athlete, which we already talked about. And also associated to this is fatigue management, which Rai, you mentioned as well. And this is like a huge consideration for the strength training piece, because even like upper body, as much as it's completely non-specific to the demands of running, if you smoke your upper body with a hard upper body session, your higher intensity runs or your longer runs will suffer. And mechanistically, my guess is that this has to do with resource allocation and the brain/nervous system just being like, hey, there was a huge fatigue cost from this, even though it's not specific. So output gets throttled down. And that needs to be honored. And so really making sure that from how you structure your training plan takes into account that there's specific things that we're looking to adapt for, and that there's a requisite amount of volume and intensity that's going to nudge the needle for that. And that there's also, maybe there's other secondary goals that the person has, like maybe they want to have more developed abs, and maybe they want to have like more developed upper body. And it's like, that's great. But if that's like the secondary goal, we might be able to move that forward very, 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 very slowly, but understanding that if we do too much with regards to that, that's going to compromise the primary objective. So that needs to be honored. And also being completely willing to, if ever that gets in the way, like sometimes you just need to shoot the hostage and it needs to go. And that's where, especially for folks who have varying levels of kind of total kind of systemic capacity, if life becomes really stressful or what have you, if they can barely tolerate their primary training, sometimes you just need to completely remove the other pieces, while also concurrently looking at how can we increase their capacity by, fostering like adequate nutritional strategies, making sure they're sleeping well, maybe encouraging them to get a therapist if they're going through a hard time in their life, so that way they have someone to talk to about their challenges, etc. But like fatigue management, honestly, is like, it cannot be understated. And I love that it's a topic that people are talking about more and more and more nowadays, because it's such a huge piece of this puzzle. So once again, first one would be, go ahead, man.
I was just going to say that fatigue management is probably the thing I focus on most when designing my workout week. Is just like, I've got to train. I'm effectively training for 4 sports, like swimming, biking, running, and lifting. And that's a lot of, I'm never going to optimize any one of those while trying to train all 4. So the best I can do is just try to manage that volume, at the moment, because I'm really increasing my endurance volume. My lifts, I have 4 low body exercises a week. That's 12, 16 sets in total, not including like warm-ups and stuff. This is not a lot of low body weightlifting volume, but I know that given all the other stuff that I'm doing, I can't really tolerate much more.
Yeah, man, to your point. And like on that note, the way that I structure it, which I'm assuming is very similar to you, where I have the primary pieces of my training that I look at my calendar and I insert in. So like, for instance, yesterday I had a 30K long run. Today's off. Tomorrow I have an easy recovery. Thursday I have sprints. I have like 15 by 200 meter repeats. And then Sunday I have a 33K long run. And so it's like those go into the calendar first. And then after that, it's like, based off of how this week is looking, can I add in anything else that will be synergistic or potentiate? Or if I add it in, if it would be a deterrent, then I'm not adding it into my program, even though I would like to. Like, I really like training upper body. I love how my body feels when I train lower body. But I know that, especially with a demanding week like I have this week, I need to honor that my capacity is limited, especially if I want to have effective training on Thursday and then on Sunday. So the first 3 points that we talked about are specificity, and then rate of progression, and then fatigue management. And then the fourth piece, which we kind of already talked about a little bit, has to do with frequency and intensity. One of the big things that really ruins a lot of runners once they get past the kind of beginner gains, like newbie gains piece, is that a lot of runners will just run moderate intensity and moderate to high distances, and hoping that that will continue to nudge the needle for them. But unfortunately, what it kind of ends up doing is that you end up incurring a bunch of fatigue from those runs. And the runs themselves are not actually stimulative enough to really nudge the needle with regards to endurance and or with speed. So you end up getting kind of a shitty stimulus for both endurance and speed, while also accumulating a lot of fatigue, which masks or compromises your ability to perform. So this is where, bringing it back to one of the things we talked about earlier, which is like the power and the usefulness of like having significant differences in like low volume, high intensity, and higher volume, low intensity work in one's training.
Essentially,
is really
undulating periodization for running.
Yeah, 100%. And so for those that haven't heard of undulating, Rye, could you define that roughly?
Yeah, I mean, it's essentially what you said, where you throughout like a training, let's just say like a training block, rather than having the intensity or volume remain static across all sessions, you have higher intensity or higher volume sessions, and then lower intensity and lower volume sessions. Essentially, you're just training. You're accumulating a different amount of fatigue in each session, or you're training different training qualities in different sessions as well. But essentially, it's just a way of reallocating volume / intensity throughout the week as a means of hopefully driving more recovery.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally, man. So yeah, and like as a beginner, like I kind of alluded to earlier, initially for like one thing that's kind of annoying in the running community when it comes to programming is people talk about how this idea of like run slow to run fast. And what they're talking about there is essentially like the usefulness of like easy runs, like zone 2 heart rate type stuff or low zone 3 runs as a means of like building the aerobic engine. And the benefit of that is that it doesn't, and the reason why people say this is that when you get to a point where you can actually do a zone 2 run, it isn't fatiguing. Like, and honestly, I only really experienced this for like quite literally what felt like the first time, probably about like 4-ish months ago, where I went out for a run and my heart rate was, for me, very low. It was 9K. I finished it, went to the pub with some friends, and I was just like, felt completely fine. Like there was no accumulation of fatigue after. I felt like completely okay. And I was like, this is weird. I've never felt that. That took me about 2 years to get to. So this advice of like run slow to run fast does apply, but it only seems to really apply once you reach a certain kind of baseline level of conditioning. For a lot of like newer runners, it's going to be like, yeah, like pretty well, like most of your runs are going to be hard because you're not fit. And until you really start to build a lot of fitness, it's going to be really hard for you to go on a run without your heart rate spiking because you just haven't adapted, and you haven't adapted physiologically to be able to sustain the work at a lower heart rate. So the general recommendation, even like, for like my newer runners that I'm working with, I'll tell them like, yeah, go on an easier run as a means of hopefully teaching them like, what does it feel like to listen to my body when I'm doing this thing and to not go too hard out of the gate. But the truth is that all of the runs are moderate. And I know that it's coached in a certain way as a means of encouraging. I don't know if interoception would be the right word here, because I technically think interoception is subconscious, a little bit like proprioception. But I digress. The idea is the same, where it's like just fostering a certain amount of kind of body awareness. So I know, I feel like I'm kind of going in circles. Oh, did I lose you guys a little bit?
You're good.
Okay, great. So long story short, at the beginning with, in case it cut out, for newer athletes, at the beginning, most of your training is going to kind of be a slog until you reach a point where, from a baseline conditioning perspective, you can actually then start really incorporating greater differences in terms of higher intensity days and lower intensity days, because you can actually do lower intensity days. Brett, do you have any follow-up thoughts on that? I know you have a lot of experience in endurance training as well. You're muted, by the way.
Thanks.
Gotcha.
I think you hit kind of like most of the major points. I do like, I understand there's some limitations with the expression "run slow to run fast." It's a catchphrase and it's never going to explain things fully. I think it can be really valuable for newer runners because, as you alluded to, like they tend to find that comfortable pace and always run that pace. Even if you tell them run a 2K today and run an 8K tomorrow, they'll probably run those two runs at the exact same pace. So getting people to like go to the track or do some hill repeats and then, program in a slightly longer run and tell them you are not allowed to go faster than this pace. And that kind of shocks people sometimes, because usually they're always like gunning for that faster and faster pace. And when you're like, no, you actually are not allowed to run faster than 6:30 on this run, it might come as a bit of a shock.
Yeah, totally, man. Yeah, and like to your point, there's a lot more nuance. Take a sip. to this conversation. But yeah, generally speaking, and even to your point there, Brett, like, and what you're talking about there is like, even for a beginner, like, getting them to go to the track and doing some like faster repeats and stuff. I think there's definitely value to that. And as fitness and capacity increases, that's also when you can start to increase frequency as well, where like if someone isn't completely smoked at the end of those runs and on a weekly basis, you're not redlining in terms of capacity, you can add in like more easy running, which would be like, or easy in air quotes, which would hopefully be less stimulative, but can still kind of build the aerobic engine gradually. So there are honestly a lot of ways to program endurance running, endurance programming for endurance sport, excuse me. That initially, like, I had no idea until I kind of started getting immersed in this world and being like, holy crap, there's like thousands of ways to organize a fartlek run, which is like a long run with intervals in it. There are 1,000 ways to organize interval runs, thousands of ways to organize like a weekly training program, then also like a monthly training program. But one of the big things I think is, maybe this will be one of the things we end with today, is that even the best coaches in the world, and one of them that I follow a lot, his name's Olav Alexander Boo, and he is like the Norwegian coach for these two Norwegian guys in the triathlon scene that are just destroying people. Brett, I'm blanking on their names, so I'm curious if you know who they are, the two Norwegian dudes.
I'm not really plugged into the
Okay.
world triathlon scene.
It's honestly, these guys are mega. But long story short, this guy has an engineering background, and he's known for like using crazy tech and gathering a bunch of data when working with his athletes. And everybody wants to interview him about like the rectal probes that he uses and like all the various ways that he gathers data about the athlete's physiology. And I heard one interview with him where he was kind of not annoyed, but he was very firm, where he was like, the thing that matters the most is the athlete. So it's like really engaging with the athlete and like leveraging their feedback and truly listening to what they have to say matters a lot, and might actually in many cases matter more than the more kind of objective data that you have. So it always comes back to like the person that's doing the training.
Cool.
Any other closing thoughts, gentlemen, before we wrap?
No, man, that was it was interesting to just kind of sit back and listen. You know, it's I'm removed enough from that world, but it's interesting to just hear specifics within a sport that I'm less familiar with, but then also be able to draw some parallels between that and other sport training as well, because the principles are all the same. Mm-hmm. But it does like tickle my curiosity a little bit, just because it's a sport that I myself have very little experience with.
Yeah, man. And to your point, and this is why everything that we teach focuses on teaching the principles and the components, because it's all, whether we're talking about like, the sport of powerlifting, the sport of bodybuilding, baseball, or runners, whether it be road or trail, it's kind of the same considerations, but that lead to different outcomes when it comes to program design. So principles matter far more than systems. You guys might be sick of me saying that, but I'm going to say it again. Great. Well, I mean, today was really great. I appreciate you guys. We went way longer than I had anticipated, but
you're on a roll, man.
I'm happy we did. Hopefully other people enjoyed it as well. I really appreciate you guys carving out the time for today. And I look forward to our next conversation. Have a great day, gentlemen.
You bet.
Cheers.
Bye for now.